Okay, let's go ahead and get officially started. Welcome back, everyone, to our 2025 Winter Learning Series. It's kind of not really winter anymore at this point, but we'll see. It's still March. Glad to see everyone here again, or for the first time. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory, and also with MRBO here tonight is Ethan Duke. We're the co-founders of MRBO, and our mission is conservation via science, education, and advocacy. And as always, you can find out all kinds of things about MRBO on our website, which is just mrbo.org. Um, I want to send our thanks to the folks who have helped us fund this winter learning series for these 13 weeks. That is the Conservation Federation of Missouri David Risberg Memorial Grant and MRBO supporters, everyone that donates to our organization, helps us keep the lights on around here and do all of the things that we do. So as folks who've been here on this series before know, we host these sessions with the hope that they will help you become more informed and inspired and involved in taking action on behalf of our native ecosystems, wildlife, and people as well. So we have a very important topic this evening in terms of conservation of healthy ecosystems, wildlife, and definitely people. From my friend, Dr. Megan Wolff, who is one of my mentors over the last few years on the topic of plastic. We're super excited to have her. Megan holds a doctorate and a master's degree in public health from Columbia University. She believes that the well-being of the ecosystem and the health of those who live in it are inextricable. We cannot live on a planet that we pollute. Megan's first dream job at age 8 was to join Greenpeace to zip around in Zodiac boats, saving whales from extinction. As a grown-up, she worked for over a decade in the Department of Psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College in New York City, but in 2021, turned back to older ideas and became the health policy director at Beyond Plastics, an advocacy group fighting plastic pollution. During that time, she served on the Minderoo-Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health, a research group whose comprehensive report on the health impacts of plastic was released in March 2023. She continues to give lectures and teaches a course on this topic. Megan just launched her own nonprofit called PSNAP, Physicians and Scientists Network Addressing Plastics and Health. And we're going to put all kinds of links in the chat for you to learn more about that. In her free time, which she's not going to have very much of anymore because she started a nonprofit, Megan gardens, hikes, and drinks coffee. So, Dr. Wolff, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dana. Sometimes there's not enough coffee. It's true, but I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really flattered to hear you say you think of me as a mentor. That's wow, cool. I have a lot to say, and there's often not enough time to say it because I can go for hours. But I'm going to try to keep it timely and tidy. But that said, I'm going to launch into my presentation right now so that there's time for questions because usually there are some. So we're going to be talking plastics in public health, the unsettling latest in medical research. It's both your good fortune and your misfortune that I have a public health background here. PSNAP, the new org, is designed to take action on plastics and health because we have more than enough information to act. It's time to act. And I'm going to give you some of that information now. I will say I got started in public health actually by studying the history of medicine. And one of the great takeaways, and I mean great in a good way, from history is that it's not inevitable. If you look backward at what happened and when, you can pretty much always identify individuals who made choices based on their circumstances, their personal biases, and so on. And those choices caused things to zig instead of zag. They might have zagged instead of zigged. You can look back and you can find the points where things could have happened very differently. If things are not inevitable, they're solvable. And I like to think about this now, especially as we're working through the climate crisis, because the climate crisis was not inevitable. We put it there, we can solve it. And this is also true for the plastics crisis, as we will discuss. And this is what gets me through every day, because there's so much bad news, but the good news, and I wouldn't be fighting this fight if I didn't think we could win it, is that we can win it. So what's the problem? At first glance, the problem is volume. We've produced nearly 10 billion tons of plastic since 1950, which is an awful lot of plastic, and it does not biodegrade. Plastic will not break down in the environment. It will not go back to its original elements. It will only break up into smaller and smaller fragments. So almost all of the plastic ever created is still with us today, and the exceptions are those that were burned, incinerated, which created more chemical reactions, often turning plastics into dioxins and other harmful chemicals that move through the air. So that's a problem. All right. But there are a couple of other things to think about in this problem. This is fascinating to me. This is the graph of plastics production. More than half of the plastic in existence today came to us since the year 2000. That is super recent. We can think about many of us where we were in the year 2000 and remember, not imagine, a world with less than half of the plastic than we have right now. Um, that's as solvable to me. But the other thing that's interesting to me is the rest of this graph here, which only goes up to 2050, but the forecast is that plastic production will triple by 2060. So if we think we have a lot of plastic here, I'm not sure where all of this pink stuff is going to go. So the mixed message here is, okay, we did it. We did it really recently, and we're on track to do a whole lot more of it, which means we need to stop. We need to think very carefully, and we need to get the message out about what's going on. Well, what is going on? This is a historical adage that I like a lot. The invention of the ship was the invention of the shipwreck. Not all plastic is a hot mess. Plastic can be enormously useful, and when it was put into mass production during World War II and afterward, it was cheap to manufacture. It's malleable. The very word plastic means malleable. You can use it for practically anything. It can be heat resistant, it can be weather resistant, it can be water resistant. It seemed a miracle material, especially because it didn't break down all that easily. You could batter it around pretty well. But with a material like that, that's not going to break down, and that is so persistent, you might think that you would use it judiciously, that you would only use it for things that you knew you really needed it for because it's going to be with us forever. Only that's not what we did. And that's the shipwreck part. Using plastic for single use purposes, using it as commonly and as freely as we do right now, is effectively the shipwreck. I've heard it say that plastic didn't fail us, we failed plastic because our utilization is such a design flaw. So we get a lot of plastic floating around the environment, and you don't see very many plastic pollution deniers because it's everywhere. And at first glance, it could almost look adaptive, but don't be fooled. It is not adaptive. On the macro level, we absolutely know that plastic harms all kinds of animals, first and foremost birds, and even more so seabirds, but that it's also a terrestrial problem, that animals graze on it, that everything and everyone is capable of swallowing plastic or being tangled in it, and it causes great suffering to wildlife. But the place where this story turns, and it turns away from a litter and wildlife problem and into a human problem, is microplastics, which you've probably heard quite a lot of or a lot about in the last 3 to 5 years. The term microplastic wasn't coined until about 2005, but what it means is those plastics that break up, like this bottle. If you put it in the sun, if you put it in the water, it's going to break up into smaller and smaller fragments. And those fragments can go down to the size of a pencil eraser. Anything smaller than that is considered a microplastic. Now, microplastics will get even smaller. They can be the size of a pencil tip. They can be the size of a grain of salt. Actually, I have a slide that's a little out of order here. There you go, pencil tip, grain of salt. But then they can even get smaller and smaller, and those are called nanoplastics. And nanoplastics can be the size of a particle of smoke, or a virus, or a strand of DNA. And as a result of that, they're capable of getting embedded in basically every part of the ecosystem, into rain, into snow, into wind, into dust. They are everywhere. And that's changed the game quite a bit because plastic pollution was visible everywhere. But as microplastics and nanoplastics, It's also invisible everywhere. As we begin to look at it under the microscope, which we've been doing since 2005, but especially 2018, we're realizing that we are in a world as suffused with microplastics as it seems like it might have once been suffused with germs. We see it everywhere. We know it's everywhere. And oh, it looks like that. It also looks like that. This is an example of the ways in which microplastics and nanoplastics do get caught up in the ecosystem. So this is a microplastic filament. It will have come off of any textile, from a fleece to a set of sheets that are made out of microfibers, they're called. They shed constantly. They shed even more in the wash, but about 50% of what sheds off of them is just from wear, ordinary wear. And they're so small, they pick up and blow around, they get evaporated, they come back down as snow and as rain. They also come back up with plants and plant vasculature because as they saturate agricultural soils, they create basins of microplastics, which plants do take up. This is a wheat plant with microplastics in its vasculature. Now, we don't know a whole lot about what this really means yet. This is a nascent point of science, but we do know that plants that take up microplastics have lower crop yields. And we also know that soils that are suffused with microplastics are not nearly as healthy and productive as soils that aren't. And part of that is because the microplastics mess with the soil biota, they mess with earthworms, they mess with insects, they effectively clog up the ecosystem at its basic point of generation. And here's an example of that. This insect was spotted by some investigators in Adirondack State Park, which is in New York State, in January 2023. And what was really surprising to them, aside from how coated in microplastic this insect was that the Adirondacks are considered a totally pristine part of New York State. There's no plastic manufacture, there's no mass disposal, there's no nearby incineration or recycling or anything that you would think would produce this level of plastic. So these microplastics were caught up on air currents and in rain, and they made their way in this density to this very secluded spot. Well, if we know that we have microplastics in the soil, in the air, in the water, we know that we're ingesting them too. And one thing we can do about that is laugh at it because what are you going to do? So, flour, sugar, coffee, tea, microplastics. But the other way to think about it is, well, what are they doing? They're getting into our bodies. How? One route is going to be inhalation because we're breathing them. Another is ingestion because they're throughout the food web. Dermal absorption. Some microplastics may be able to cross the skin as nanoplastics. That's still a little bit up in the air, but we do know that the chemicals that are in plastic do cross the skin. And then maternal to fetal transmission. So I'll be getting back to all of those, but we know that they're all possibilities. We know that they're all happening. So what does it mean? So Dana mentioned that I got to work on a study called the Minderoo-Monaco Commission for Plastics and Human Health. And this was just four of us when we finally finished it. We started as 12 or 24, and a year later we were 48 people across the globe combing through all the clinical literature, looking for all of the impacts that were known about plastics on human health. The person who launched this study is this guy here, Philip Landrigan, who's a pediatrician and an epidemiologist, and he cut his career looking at lead and lead poisoning in children and demonstrating that there was absolutely no safe level of lead that didn't cause neurodevelopmental toxicity, meaning it didn't mess with kids' intelligence, their brains, their capacity for cognition. He's been doing this effectively his entire life. Moving on from lead, he moved on to pesticides and children. And now he's looking at plastics because plastics tick almost all the same boxes that lead and pesticides do in terms of toxicity. So we worked on this report. We launched it in 2023, and it's practically old news by now. But what it was designed to do was to serve as a touchstone, putting in one place everything we knew. So what did we know and what bothered us most on the Minderoo Commission? Well, the first thing that really got us was the idea of, well, what is plastic made of? If you want to know what it's doing inside the body, because we know it's in there, we should look at what it's made of and what its ingredients can do. It actually surprises a lot of people to think about it, But plastics are made out of fossil fuel, fossil carbon, most commonly oil and fracked gas, though they could also be manufactured out of coal. It takes a long time to go from a measure of oil or fracked gas or coal to, say, my glasses frames or a set of Legos. So you're going to have to add a whole bunch of chemicals. So many chemicals, so many additives to give plastics their properties like flexibility, rigidity, make them see through, make them water resistant, keep them from bursting into flame or make them green or whatever. Any given piece of plastic, any item, can be as much as 50% additive by weight. So we're looking at a lot of chemicals. Most of those chemicals are unstudied. When we did the Minder report, in 2023, we were able to identify 13,000 chemicals that went into the production of plastics. And just 1 year later, that number went up to 16,325. This science is moving at an incredibly fast rate, but the ratios stayed the same. Of the chemicals that are used to manufacture plastic, we know that more than 25% are hazardous. And what do I mean by hazardous? I mean, it is not in dispute that they cause cancer, that they interrupt neurodevelopment for babies, and that they disrupt hormones. They're endocrine disruptors. So we know that about 26%. 66% we have no data on at all. Nobody knows what they are or what they do. They're totally unstudied. And yes, it is allowable to put unstudied chemicals in mass quantities into the market. That is allowed because it's not considered a food or a drug. It's just a chemical going into an item. Of course, just is relative, and I'll get there in just a minute. Of the rest of the chemicals, some of them are less hazardous, and less than 1% are non-hazardous. So we have that going for us, less than 1%. So, okay, 161, but of course, that's incomplete evidence. So the Minderu team knew that we were looking at trouble here just based on what chemicals and attributes plastics are made out of. But the trouble gets thicker when you actually look at the chemistry. And I promise this is the only chemistry slide I will make you suffer through. But going back to Chemistry 101 in high school, what is plastic? Plastic is a carbon-carbon molecule. It's a polymer backbone, carbon-carbon bonds. These are they. And they're covalently bonded, meaning they have those double bonds. They're really, really hard to break. You've got to work hard and long to mess up this molecule, which is why plastic is so durable. But like I said, in order to give it its properties, we're going to put in some chemical additives. And I'm just going to talk about the ones you've probably heard of, and I won't even get into it really, but phthalates, there's some bisphenols, some PFAS, some brominated flame retardants. Without even having to get too far into what these are and do, we can at least say, don't eat them. Just don't eat them. They're on the do not eat list, which is easier said than done because they are not particularly bonded to this chemical at all, to this molecule. They just sit inside the molecular structure. And from the very beginning, they leach out, they migrate into whatever is around the plastic. So plastic is stable, but it is not inert. These chemicals leach. So if there's any one thing that you take home from this lecture tonight, it is do not microwave any food in a plastic container. If that container, if that vegetable bag says microwave safe, what they're talking about is the container, not the food. The container won't visibly denature inside your microwave. It's not going to melt all over the microwave. But the added heat energy is going to cause those chemicals to leach out more quickly. Couple other rules of thumb about food and plastic, aside from high temperatures, things you want to think about in terms of whether you want to eat that food that was touching the plastic is how long was it in touch with the plastic? Has it been sitting in the pantry for a year or two, on that back shelf, or even in the refrigerator? Think a couple times about that. What's the portion size? How much surface to volume ratio do you have between the plastic and the food? We call them food contact materials. The more contact the plastic has with the food, the more chemical migration is going to happen. And also fat solubilities. An awful lot of the chemicals that are used in plastic are what's called lipophilic. meaning they like fat. They move preferentially into fat. So cheese wrapped in plastic, meat wrapped in plastic, French fries sitting in plastic containers, or quite a lot, frankly, of fast food materials. They have coatings and plastics on them. Think carefully about that. You're going to get a much higher plastics load from those. Okay, those are the chemicals. That is worrying enough, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. That's a class, which I teach if you want to take it. But this was the other thing that really bothered the Minderoo authors about plastics and human health. This is microplastics. Microplastics get embedded in human organs, they're inside of us. And once they're inside our bodies, they basically act like tiny Trojan horses because they're constantly leaching those chemicals. Now, the chemicals aren't in the plastic, the chemicals are the plastic. For as long as those plastic bits are there, they are going to continue to leach chemicals. And what do we know about those chemicals? Well, we know in a petri dish that if you put plastics next to living cells, by and large, the living cells die. Uh, and we also know that that's what happens in the animal models. When you have plastics inside of animal models, you feed animal plastics, you transpose plastics into their bodies, they breathe plastics. We see a huge range of disease and mortality. Now, one of the authors on the report told me going in, he said, we know it's happening in the animal models. What we don't have yet is the data on the human models, but we know that what happens in the animal models generally happens in the human models too. So that's what we're watching for. And just before we got going on this study, people were already beginning to identify where the plastics were in the human models. This one from January of 2021 was the first one that was really alarming to investigators. The assumption had always been if you're eating and drinking and breathing microplastics, you're probably passing the vast majority of them. And you are. More than 90% you pass right through your body. But the other 10% are hanging out there. And so where are they going? Hopefully, no place harmful. The idea is for a fetus, you've got the placenta protecting it. Nothing can cross the placental barrier. The fetus is fully insulated from whatever mom is being exposed to. Not true. January 2021, investigators in Italy demonstrated that there were microplastics on both sides of the placenta. They were moving right through it and into the human fetus. And we knew that because one of the next findings, as we started to look for where they were, was meconium. That's the first stool that a human infant passes when first born. No, that's passed before this infant has had an opportunity to eat anything. So it's already in their systems. We knew that in June 2021. Going forward, it's been a bonanza of finding microplastics all over the human body. So sputum, blood. I was at a Minderoo conference meeting actually in May of 2022 when the blood finding came out. And we looked at each other and we said, blood-brain barrier, anyone? Because that was the other place that it has always been assumed, hopefully, that plastics are not going to cross. They're not going to get into the brain. They're not going to mess with our cognition. But we knew that they were in circulating blood by 2022. Breast milk, liver, urine, veins, testes and semen. And by the way, yes, this is correlated with erectile dysfunction, heart tissue, kidney, it goes on and on. This was one of the more arresting studies. This came out about a year ago this week in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is basically the threshold for unimpeachability. By the time you're in the New England Journal of Medicine, you are so carefully vetted and so carefully studied, you're not going to run up against a lot more opposition because you've faced it all down. In this study, investigators looked at the carotid arteries of patients who had undergone a procedure to basically have their arteries cleaned out. If you're at risk for stroke and heart attack and they find that you have high cholesterol, your arteries are clogged, they go in and they basically do a roto-rooter procedure and they pull out the plaque. In this study, they looked at, I think it was 328 patients, and they analyzed the plaque under the microscope and they found nanoplastics in 58% of the people who they studied. So 58% of people had nanoplastics in their carotid arteries. They then followed people forward to see how they did, and only in the patients that had the nanoplastics, they found a 450% increase in heart attack, stroke, and death. So those were some pretty stark outcomes. Now, this is one study. As they say, correlation is not causation, but these were very, very loud findings, and they caught the attention of quite a lot of the medical community in they're just highly suggestive. So the next place that we're looking is in the human brain. And as of that same summer, there were some things coming out of, that suggested maybe plastics were crossing into the brain. It wasn't entirely clear. And then this article came out in preprint toward the end of the summer. Preprint meaning it hadn't passed through all of the peer review yet, but it was up on the internet because it was under review and the findings were so potentially important that it was worth getting it out there immediately. This study looked at cadavers, and it looked at cadavers of people who had died in the 20 teens and then in the 2020s. They looked at three different sets of organs. They looked at kidneys, they looked at liver, and they looked at brain tissue. And they analyzed how much plastic was in each of those tissues. They found quite a bit of plastic in the human brain, more so in the people who had died more recently. Total plastics concentration in brains increased over 50% in the last 8 years. So if you had passed on in the 2020s, you could have as much as 50% more plastic in your brain. They found that polyethylene was the most common of the types of plastic. Polyethylene is what they make plastic bags out of. It's very, very common in single-use plastics, which makes sense. If it's common in the environment, it's going to be common in us. So they found that. MNPs is what researchers call micro and nanoplastics. They found that they're selectively accumulated into the human brain. Now, that was particular, meaning they found that there were more plastics in the brain than in the other organs of the body. So not only is it crossing the blood-brain barrier, but it's doing it preferentially. And the reason they think that's happening is because the brain is the fattiest organ in the body. The only thing that has more fat than the brain is fat tissue itself, adipose. So chemicals are being drawn toward those fatty lipids and they're being selectively accumulated there. They also found a correlation between people who had a history of Alzheimer's or dementia and plastic concentration. Those who had Alzheimer's or dementia had 5 to 10 times more plastics in their brains than did others. Now, this study came out officially about a month ago, and so it's been all over the news. It really kickstarted another wave of reporting on microplastics and health, and has gotten quite a lot of attention. So if you're hyperventilating at this point, you are not alone. I'm not really sure how it is that I manage to handle all this all the time. Here's a picture of some kittens. Just take a breath, let it out, take another breath. Okay, these kittens were actually born while I was teaching my class a couple semesters ago, and they made it a much easier time for me and for my students. So, all right, we're going to move on. Um, all right, so what are some of the consequences of this? Well, the thing that the Minderoo team was the most focused on in terms of health outcomes was the impact of these plastics and their chemicals on the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system is a network of glands that creates and releases hormones like estrogen, testosterone, melatonin, and insulin. Those are familiar ones. This network regulates all the biological processes in your body from conception through adulthood and into old age, including the development of the brain and the nervous system, the growth and function of the reproductive system, metabolism, mood, blood sugar levels, and the immune system, among others. So if you can think of it, it's going to be regulated by your endocrine system. If that system doesn't function properly, neither does your body. Just think about diabetes and insulin. So, when endocrine disrupting chemicals impact our bodies, they affect necessary systems throughout, which means that they can impact the hormones that regulate our appetite and metabolism, causing obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. They can cause cancers, especially breast, prostate, and testicular cancers, all of which are on the uptick. Now, the thing about these dudes is that tiny doses matter enormously. Very, very small amounts of hormones work at masterful critical moments in human development, especially in the fetus, things that are just developing, still setting down their networks and pathways. And those have profound effects. They create our normal body structure, they determine its function in later life. Anything that happens in the womb is going to be amplified across life, across systems. This means that the periods of greatest vulnerability to endocrine disruption is the fetal period, the newborn period, the toddler period. The timing makes the poison. What happens in the womb does not stay in the womb. Think of it this way for neurocognition. So a child that's growing in the fetus is laying down networks of neurons at incredibly fast rates. They're growing, they're dividing, they're migrating to where they need to be super, super fast. Now, this happens to be a schematic of the New York City subway system. And anybody who's ever tried to catch a train in New York knows that if things are not going right somewhere in the system, they're blocked up everywhere. Or they can be going right for a little while, but then they get stuck. So, for instance, if you were on the one train, you're heading down the west side of New York City, and you get out here and you want to make a change in Brooklyn, and you can't because it didn't lay down the track properly, you are not going anywhere. You're not getting out there. This is a basic metaphor for how neurocognition works. If the tracks are laid down improperly in utero, then what you find in the infant and the developing child is a developmental disorder. And that's what we're getting. That's really what we're getting. 1 in 36 kids now in the United States is on the autism spectrum disorder, well, on the spectrum for ASD. That is an enormous difference from, say, the 1970s when I was born, or even 1995. And a little bit of this is, yes, changes in diagnostics. So girls are now more frequently diagnosed than they used to be because they're watched more carefully. And changes, for instance, in diagnoses like Asperger's used to be considered a separate disorder, and now it's considered a part of the spectrum. But these numbers are much bigger than just a diagnostic bias. They're also particularly, they move along gender lines. So, what is it? 1 in 4, 3 in 4 kids who have autism spectrum disorder are boys. That strongly suggests that there's a hormonal thing going on, a hormonal connection, and that is what it's looking like we're seeing. Now, what is it? It's well, that's probably enough for now. There's a study that I've just been focused on recently that shows a causal relationship between bisphenol A, which is one of the most commonly used um, chemicals in plastics. About 95% of all bisphenol A is used to make plastic. Bisphenol A interrupts an enzyme called aromatase, which is important in the brain development of male fetuses, biologically designated male fetuses. And when it does its thing, when it is present in the maternal body during development, you do wind up with a disproportionate number of biologically male persons who have autism spectrum symptoms. So that's breaking information, and I'll be able to explain it better in the future. But it's just been coming out recently, and people are paying attention. But this is not the only place that we think that we're seeing impacts. All this research and understanding is showing, in short, that it's really happening. These are chronic diseases across the lifespan, across time, non-communicable in the world, 1990 to 2019, and they're all on the uptick. And it's important to emphasize that this is corrected for age. So this is not just an aging population or a bigger population. This is relative, and we're seeing more of these diseases. Now, it's all a relatively new field of research, with our scientists just finding microplastics in our bodies beginning around 2018. What we do know is that chronic disease burden is steadily increasing over the same period that plastic production is increasing. The rate of rise is too steep and too quick and involves younger and younger people. So we can't say that this is an evolutionary change. It has to be from an environmental influence when the change is seen as quickly as what we're seeing. This is, to be sure, multifactorial. There are a lot of things that can go into it, but research shows overwhelming correlation to plastic toxicity and the increase of chronic diseases. Causality is being found more and more, as it just recently has been with autism. Because of the thousands of chemicals, not everything has been studied, but the most common chemicals show definitive harm to humans and other living beings. Now, in medicine, we work under what's called the precautionary principle, where if we think something is harmful, we avoid it until it's proven to be safe. With plastic, it's worked in the opposite direction. So we're only just now gathering the data. But here's another point of that data. Sperm counts have been declining since 1970, and over the last 10 years, they're declining even faster than they were since the 70s. Now, this is going hand in hand with a general decrease in fertility. You don't notice it because there are so many humans that a small decrease in individuals isn't affecting the population. But if you think about who you may know who has been using a fertility clinic, who has had to have some sort of assisted reproductive technology, and what they tell people increasingly in those clinics, which is to avoid plastics in the kitchen and elsewhere in your house, we are finding these to be correlated. So, this is what gets me thinking here. Chemical industry sales and plastic production go hand in hand. About 70% of the chemicals currently under production are used to make plastics. If we're planning to triple plastic production by 2060, and that's a projection by industry is saying it wants that, they're very open about it, then we're also looking at a coincident rise in chemical industry sales. But given that those are largely endocrine disruptors, the ones that are studied, we know are endocrine disruptors, I look at this and I start to wonder about survivability. So I asked one of the scientists who's been working on this for 35 years. It's actually the guy who coined the term endocrine disruption. He was going over this graph in a presentation of his, and I said, Pete, when I look at this, the word survivability comes to mind. Is that crazy? Am I being histrionic? Like, should I never say that in front of a group of people? And Pete said, I think in this case, it's a kind way of putting it. So the researchers are really worried. So here's some kittens again. Take another breath, let it out. The kittens were adorable. They destroyed my house. It was totally worth it. Take another breath, let it out. All right. So, why is this happening now? This is a historian's question. This is about, well, why didn't we start seeing all of these health problems 25 years ago? Why is there so much more plastic right now, even than there was, say, in 2010? Why are they making more now? This is counterintuitive, but true. Part of it is actually the climate crisis itself. As the world heats up, and there's not much denying that it is heating up. Last year was the hottest year on record. This past winter was the hottest winter on record. And by record, I mean you can look at the fossil record, and you can find that these are the hottest years in the last 125,000 on the fossil record. So the Earth has basically warmed to a temperature that is warmer than it was as the human species evolved. We've passed the 1.5 degrees centigrade mark. We're on our way to 2. It's here. So how are people responding? Well, they're responding in part by switching to renewable energy. Whenever they have the opportunity, whenever they're able to do it, people are installing solar panels, they're moving to wind energy, they're moving over and away from the fossil carbons that got us into this situation. That's great news. And if it can continue, it's continuous great news. But it's not good if you happen to be a fossil fuel producer. Then it's going to be eating into your margins. But they saw this coming. Fossil carbon industry is not dumb. They saw this coming decades ago, and realizing that they would be still extracting an awful lot of fossil carbon from the ground, but maybe losing market share for it, Plan B came into action, and Plan B was single-use plastics. That production curve with all that pink on it, is the opportunity that industry sees to correct for what it may lose in revenue from people switching over to renewable energy. And let's be really clear about this. Plastic production is a climate problem because plastic is made out of fossil carbon. So, for instance, to make a plastic bottle, you're going to need this amount of petroleum. And then to transport that same bottle to market, you're going to use that much more. So, we're using and burning carbon in order to make plastic. And we're also putting it into the plastic. If plastic were a country, it would be the world's fifth largest greenhouse gas emitter, just ahead of Brazil and behind Russia. This is not nothing. This is not nothing to this tune. This is a sort of confusing graph, but if we stopped producing extra plastic right now, even if we zeroed out our use of fossil fuels, if we totally decarbonized the grid, we would still be producing pretty much too much plastic to meet our climate goals. Put another way, decarbonizing the power grid will not be enough. There we go. That actually is the same way. Will not be enough to reach climate goals if we continue to produce plastics as we do now. But we're on track for a whole lot more growth than we have right now. So we're going to blow right past all the savings that we do with renewable energy if we continue to manufacture plastic at the rate that we're going. So how do we solve this? Well, like I said at the beginning, before I depressed everybody, this is solvable. This is brand new. We can look at the policies that we have in place, and we can find even the individuals who put those policies into action. We can find why they did it, where they did it, and how they did it. We know that regulatory systems are the most efficient and the most just way to change the equation. And we know that we need to turn off the plastics tap on single-use plastic, which, by the way, 42% of all plastic under production today is single-use plastic. So that's actually most of the problem right there. If we can use regulatory systems, if we can use policy to turn off the tap on that plastic production, we're halfway to changing this entirely already. And the good news is that people want to do this. Most people who sit through a lecture like this one, or read an article, or hear about it in any other capacity, really don't want microplastics in their testicles, in their placenta, in their brains. They don't want it. They also don't want the climate consequences. 81% of US voters in 2025, this year, support reducing the amount of plastic that's produced. They support national policies that reduce single use plastic foam, so that's polystyrene, and they support increasing the use of reusable packaging and reusable foodware. People want it everywhere. This poster, by the way, was up in New York City in late September, early October of this year. I went to New York for a conference on plastics and health, and this was actually, it wasn't even right outside the conference, it was elsewhere. But it was a pretty good piece of evidence that we're looking at a ground swell. So what is that swell capable of? Well, it's capable of the moon, the sun, and the stars, frankly, although we need a functioning democracy to get it there. The way that we've been trying to get it there is local action, which eventually will turn into federal action if we still have a federal government that is democratic. At present, 12 states and over 500 cities and towns have, for instance, a plastic bag ordinance in effect, which says you can't just distribute plastic bags for free at the point of sale when you're getting groceries. People need to bring their own bags. You can sell bags, but we're just going to not give them out hand over fist. This by itself actually makes an enormous difference, in part because it draws down the amount of single-use plastic, but also because it signals to people that there's something going on here. Plastic is not as innocent as we thought, and it requires a certain amount of habit change. So it gets people thinking about their plastics use. And this has been going on all over the world for quite some time. National level regulation to ban and limit the use of bags has been happening all over the world. So there's a lot of hope in this kind of regulation. There's also an international, a global treaty that's been set out trying to reduce the production and use of single-use plastics, still being haggled over. wasn't looking too good during the last meetings last summer, and the US is now basically out of the process. Although that might be for the best because it was industry from the US that was the primary obstruction on a lot of these negotiations. If you want to learn more about this, more solutions, more details, I do teach a course, and we can drop the link to it in the chat. Hasn't started yet, which is why I'm still talking about it. This will kick off in April on the 16th. It's a 7-week online evening course, which will frighten you, but also give you more of what you just heard. It happens on Wednesday evenings from 7 p.m. Eastern until 8:50, and it's being run through Bennington College. So I will be able to provide a lot more detail on a lot more things, including solutions through this course. That said, thank you for your attention. I know it's kind of heavy sledding, but it's important stuff to know, and it starts to change the way that you look out on life. And actually, that was a misprint of my own email address because I just got a spanking new one. This is my email address, megan@psnap.org. Please feel free to reach out. And now I'm going to stop sharing and take questions.
Wow, that was great, Megan. I mean, we know you're great, so we just kind of expected it. Um, I've been looking at the chat here. There's a lot of interesting comments in there and good stuff. But the Q&A has the bulk of questions already in there. I've maybe people will add more, but I've got about 6 questions in there, and you can see they're kind of like about sustainability, materials, and plastic alternatives. And then there's a few
Mhm.
about health and environmental impacts, and there's a couple about energy and sustainability.
Okay. Fire away.
So Judy asks, and pertaining to sustainable materials and plastic alternatives, she read about the use of water hyacinth as a substitute for plastic. Can you speak to that?
I don't know that one specifically, but certainly this, the idea that we need to substitute plastics is absolutely true. But I want to iterate, we don't really need new materials. We only switched over toward plastics beginning in 1950, which, my mom is older than that. Sorry, mom. Hi, mom. Um, people with very active memories who are actively still among us remember a world that was very different. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, you know, most things were packaged in cardboard, in cans, in glass bottles. Plastic was somewhat rare, and that was fine. Those materials were non-toxic, they were easy to produce, they were easy to distribute. Yes, glass is heavier than plastic. That's true. But for the most part, we don't need a moonshot, nor do we really have time, honestly. We need to draw down plastics right now if we're going to start to have an effect. So it's nice that these new materials are being developed, and in the by and by, some of them may become very, very handy. The problem with a lot of them is that in order to get from a mushroom or seaweed or a hyacinth to a plastic seeming material, you still have to use much of the same suite of chemicals that are getting us into this mess in the first place. So the problem isn't so much the carbon that's in plastic as the chemicals that sculpt and mold that carbon. And of course, drawing that carbon out of fossil resources is itself a problem. So, yeah, we may turn a corner, but we don't need to, is the point.
Well, you may have addressed these other questions here with that, but I think there's some nuance and perspective you always come up with on this. But what's your perspective on silicone as a replacement for products such as plastic bags and cooking utensils?
That's a good question. Silicone is more inert than standard plastic, but it's not totally out of the woods. When I see the claims and I hear the hype, I'm like, oh, we've seen this film before, right? Like, this is the new miracle alternative. And when you drill down, there are a couple of organizations that do lots of testing, like the Environmental Working Group or Momavation or Million Marker Institute. They have found, for instance, that if you microwave food in silicone, Yes, chemicals do migrate into that food just like ordinary plastics, potentially at a lower rate, but frankly, just use ceramic. It's all good. Just dump it into the ceramic already. Yeah.
Awesome. So on the same bent, last one on this particular bent, I recently saw a takeout container that was marked made with 35% less oil-based resin. Does that really matter? Is that just an attempt to
No.
make consumers feel okay about continuing to use plastic?
You got it. That is a lot of greenwashing. I mean, I have to do some real like pondering, what does that even mean? 35% less oil-based resin? I guess they're talking about it being less of a petroleum product, but that's silly because a lot of the plastic in the United States is actually from fracked gas. It's from ethane that's then cracked. They superheat it to 850 degrees till the molecule cracks, and then they get ethylene, from which they make polyethylene. So a great deal of what we're using is not a oil-based resin in the first place. It's a clever way to make consumers think you're being all sciency and like clean, but it's sciency and not very clean.
Awesome. Awesome. So we can kind of transition over to the questions. Maybe there's more popping up. Yes, they just doubled. Okay. Uh, Health and environmental impacts. Dana, could you kind of tick off some of these questions that were answered so far so we can keep track of these?
I can,
Um,
because I think Megan has in fact sort of addressed several with the last two
Several.
answers, so I
Yeah.
can I can I can work on it.
Awesome. Health and environmental impacts. So another anonymous attendee said, couldn't chronic diseases increase also be attributed to ultra processed food or
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So the increase in chronic disease is coming to us from a number of places, but they all have one thing in common. They're all the post-war petrochemical era. Those ultra-processed foods are being processed using quite a lot of the same chemical and extractive processes that we're seeing in other domains. So I've had people say, you're just chemophobic, you're afraid of chemicals. Not quite true. I am afraid of synthetic chemicals made by humans that are based on fossil carbons. And those have flooded our society since World War II. Rachel Carson was the first person to point it out, and she was looking explicitly at pesticides. So we drew down dieldrin, we drew down DDT, we said, hey, look, we got rid of that, right? Not really. So the last session of my class, I call, Rachel Carson, chapter 324, because we're just that much further out into suffusing the environment with synthetic chemicals that are basically based on the same sources. And yes, they're very prominent in processed foods.
well, processed foods are just bad in general, aren't they? Another health related thing is from Robin Wall. Robin asks, RFK Jr. has focused on chronic disease. Do you know if he's focusing on microplastics or diet or other environmental factors?
I try not to pay very close attention to RFK Jr. I would say he's been like almost a silver lining in some of what's happening at HHS, but only in the sense that he has a sense of environmental health, that environmental contamination spoils the health of whatever else lives in the environment. So he has a long view. Microplastics are absolutely a part of that view. Christos Simonides, who's the person who did the study on mice and autism, talks about microplastic as actually kind of astonishing. If you have the same suite of chemicals and they're in food, they're only going to go so far because the food is only going to go so far. You have that same suite of chemicals in basically literally anything else, pesticide, whatever it is, sunblock, you name it, it's only going to go so far. But when you encapsulate them in plastic, And then you get down to microplastic. You have a distribution device for those chemicals that is heretofore unseen, unheard of, unthought of on this planet. We're managing to distribute petrochemicals into every single corner and niche of the ecosystem. Now, I don't think RFK has a grip on that, but he does have a grip on the impact of the ecosystem on bodies and on health. So,
There's another question here. It kind of falls in a different category, and I'm not sure how to apply it, but it's another one from Robin Wall. It says, "Will wind and solar meet all of our energy demands?"
yeah,
And it's just
they will if we. This is a Bill McKibben talking point, so I'm just channeling Bill McKibben here. But yes, if we build them out, we have a surplus of energy on this planet. The entire planet is energy. All wind, all sunlight, all currents are energy. It's a question of harnessing them.
yeah,
And you know, if you look at any other source of energy, all the major energy sources also had massive subsidies attached to their development, to their uptake. You know, even if you look back at something like wood, you have enormous numbers of people traveling from Europe to the New World and chopping down the forests. There's a great book on this by Annie Proulx called Barkskins. How it took a few hundred years, but the old growth forests fueled the kilns and the industry of the Industrial Revolution. And that happened because of government investment.
yeah. Well, I mean, that sounds. I completely agree with that. I will just say maybe not use the past tense in that statement because we are still subsidizing the petroleum industry, gas and oil, quite a bit, like
Yep.
billions. So
Megan and
Yep.
Eth, I just want to comment to our audience, because we don't know all of them personally, so we don't know, what they're watching and paying attention to necessarily. I mean, clearly they're in, interested and invested in a clean environment. But that is one of the most frightening things about this current federal administration is they are absolutely pinpoint targeting disinvestment in clean energy development in ways both very obvious and like very obscure.
Mhm.
That's all.
and at the same time, recognizing there's increased demand because of AI and things like that, using that as to declare some sort of emergency to bypass the protections that we have in place for decades.
Yeah.
On that nice note, what's next in the Q&A?
Are there any kittens we can show off
You're
here?
right. Right.
Let's see. Here's one that Megan, I know that you in one of your classes you hosted a speaker on this topic. I know you're very familiar with this topic. Hospitals use huge amounts of plastic, tubing, syringes,
Mm.
bedpans, etc. How can healthcare possibly overcome this? It's a great question.
Yeah, that is a good question. I've been in conversation with a lot of physicians about this because this is something that PSNAP looks at, being mostly physicians. Slowly at first and then all at once. There's a lot of ways to look at it. So, hospital systems, especially in the United States, but worldwide, have over embraced single use plastics. You know, the argument initially was this is for infection control, and you know, it made you not need huge amounts of technology to sterilize things. And so that was useful. But even when single use plastics came onto the market in medicine in the 50s and 60s, the same vendors used to sell a single use disposable version and a washable reusable version, usually made out of glass or metal. Profits really determined the move to single use plastics as producers targeted hospitals and healthcare more and more. Now, there are necessary plastics in healthcare, of course, incubators, tubing, IV bags, and so on, but a lot of it doesn't need to be there. And there's a huge distinction. So, for instance, Emergency room physicians will talk about kits that they open if they're going to be suturing someone. And the whole kit is, it's entirely sterile. They open the whole thing to get out, say, the tweezer and the scissor and some of the gauze. But there are 20 other instruments in that kit that are now no longer antiseptic. So the whole thing goes into the red bin, and the red bin goes for incineration as hazardous waste, which creates dioxins and other things. So there's a lot going on inside the hospital that physicians are noticing and nurses are noticing, healthcare personnel in general are noticing and cringing at and bringing up to sustainability committees. And in the United States, bringing that up means you kind of have to run the gamut of infection control, the C-suite, and the purchasing agents, and then also the lawyers. Then lawyers and infection control kind of move together, but you have this huge level of pushback. So I'm seeing more and more of a groundswell among physicians who want to address this and are beginning to gather data demonstrating that these practices are actually causing more harm than they are preventing infection. The infectious disease era, as we once understood it, for the moment, is mostly over. What we see in hospitals now is a glut of asthma, of diabetes, of heart disease. Not coincidentally, these are the very same diseases that are caused by environmental contaminants. So we're in a different kind of feedback loop. Medicine can very surely look at itself and say, if first do no harm or at least harm, then we really need to rethink the hospital practices with single-use plastics and disposability. It's happening a little bit more in Europe, but it's also happening here. And there's plenty to go. I mean, the lowest hanging fruit in the hospital is literally fruit. It's in the cafeteria. Why are the apples wrapped in plastic? They don't need to be. So the cafeteria is actually the least controversial place to start and someplace everybody wants to see. But throughout the hospital system, there's room for reevaluation.
I knew you'd know the answer to that one. And all of them really. Um, we have 2 that are really quite similar. Basically, like, besides limiting exposure, are there ways to remove plastic already in the body? Are there studies on how if people can lower the already accumulated microplastic load, i.e. detox?
Right. Um, it's not great news.
I
No.
was gonna say, please say yes.
No, I mean, with something like lead, you have chelation where you draw out the blood and remove the lead. We don't have that for microplastics. The more we can see, the more we do see, meaning every time we develop more technology to see smaller particles, we see more particles. So there's no filtration method, either in drinking water or in the body itself, for removal. We do have livers and, and kidneys and other organs that are our natural detoxing centers. And one thing that is now being observed is that actually levels of kidney and urethra and just general excretory disease are going up with the presence of microplastics, which is a double-edged kind of thing. It means that our bodies are filtering them out. We're excreting them. But the body parts that we're using to excrete them are becoming disproportionately exposed to microplastics and therefore vulnerable to their harms. So that's not good news either. Nobody wants me over at Thanksgiving. Uh, not all that popular in dinner parties, except if people are trying to leave. But it's where we are.
Megan, we have a question about the fact that since plastics are hormone disruptors, do we know if they contribute to gender dysphoria?
This is a common question. And what I can say is in the autism studies that Christos was working on, he actually he made a comment about this. He said, at this point in these studies, we cannot comment on gender identity at all. We don't know anything about the exposure and the gender identity, either of the mice, or there was also an infant component. What we know about is um, it is sexual development, not gender expression. So, even insofar as you see lab animals behaving in one way or another, you really don't know how that animal is identifying. It's a very different process. There's plenty of research, though, going into all numbers of impacts of endocrine disruptors, and I'm sure that this conversation will pick up, and there'll be more information for it. But at this point, there's no saying.
Here's kind of a big one, just in terms of the information that you possess. Mary asks, does recycling plastics create more issues, such as more chemical use?
Yeah, it does. Um, there's a lot of stuff on the internet. If you type in recycling, plastic recycling and scam, you'll come up with a pretty sordid history. Plastic was never designed to be recyclable. Plastic is made up of many, many, many different chemicals, different polymers. They melt at different points. They're different colors. They don't mix together very well. Those additives are different in every kind of plastic, different set. So the concept of plastics recyclability only begins in 1988 when curbside recycling had already brought the idea that normal materials like paper and cardboard and bottles, glass bottles and cans, all of that is truly recyclable, all of it. That left the plastics industry holding a literal plastic bag, saying, well, what about this? Consumers were now looking at plastic packaging and saying, well, if I can't recycle this, but I can recycle all the rest, I don't know if I want this. So the plastics industry took it back to the drawing board and said, okay, what can we plausibly argue is recyclable? And they found that resins, number one and number two, could in some forms be melted down and recycled. But those some forms are very specific. So you've probably seen signs that say like, okay, we want bottles with necks and they have to have caps on them, and we'll take laundry detergent jugs, but we won't take this bucket over here, and your cat food bucket, not going to take that even though they're all ones, and so on. This is because of the high specificity that you need to have in order to melt stuff down and then reconstitute it. So the whole idea of plastics recycling was backwardly integrated in the first place. But then when you do get to the stuff that you can recycle, which by the way, the American recycling rate, like the stuff that we put in our recycling bins that actually gets recycled, is only 5 to 6% of what we put in the bin. So it's super low. Most of it just gets incinerated or landfilled or shipped overseas. But okay, we're looking at that 5 to 6%. What they're going to do is they're going to shred it, which is going to produce a whole lot more microplastics. That's thing one. Then they're going to take those shreds and they wash them all. They wash everything through lots of water. Okay, there goes some more microplastics. And now they're going to melt it down. And in melting it down, a bunch of things are going to happen. All of that heat energy is going to move around those additives. So you're going to have a lot of off gassing. So that's going to be dangerous for any personnel anywhere nearby. And then you're going to have a whole new series of chemical reactions inside the new plastic. Now you melt it down and you melt it down into what are called nurdles. They look like this. They're these little pellets, which are now going to be all over my office, just like they're all over the environment. But I don't think I can help make people see these. Now they're in my hand. Now they're in a jar. They get everywhere. They melt them down into these little nurdles. And then those nurdles get used to make, a toy made out of 100% recycled plastic, or, this bottle, which has 2% recycled plastic. That recycled plastic, in order to, again, give it the properties that it had in the first place, you need to add all kinds of new additives. Because when you melt down those polymers, they weaken, they get gooey. So you got to add more stuff. So recycled plastic actually has more additives and more toxicants in it than virgin plastic. And it gets worse and worse. And plastic absorbs chemicals as well. So if you had, say, a bottle that was holding pesticide, and then you had another bottle that was holding pharmaceuticals, and those get recycled, the recycled material is going to contain pesticides and pharmaceuticals. So you get those residues moving forward. And no, there is no regulation of this. It is the Wild West. Yes, more cats, please. I know, seriously. Sorry. Um, that's how that works. So this pushback against plastics recycling, which has been accompanied by another pushback from industry saying recycling works, recycling is real. It's serious. It's chemically based seriousness about toxicants and hazards. Whew.
Megan, I think we should end on, you'll see why. No, 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 it's good. It's good. I think it's good. I mean, it'll lead to more upsetting information. But it's a great question, which is there a good book or article
Mm.
to read about all of this information? So what would be, maybe your top 3 to 5 even? Because I know there's
Yeah,
so
there's a
much
lot.
information out there on this topic.
Um, A Poison Like No Other by Matt Simon is about microplastics. It's about 2 years old, which with this kind of a subject is actually pretty old. But he nailed all the basics really, really well. So, A Poison Like No Other by Matt Simon. And let me just swivel and look at my bookcase for just a minute. Um, hmm, okay. There's a book called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer by Dr. Leo Trasand, Trass as in snake, Ande. And that gets into a lot of the chemical stuff that I was just talking about. That too is a few years old, so but it'll still give you a good grounding, and it was written for a lay audience. And then my other favorite is okay, I'll give you two. One is funny. So, but the not funny favorite is called Our Stolen Future. That one is actually really old, meaning it was written in the 90s, but it's about endocrine disruption and what we came to understand about how all of this works. That is the clearest and the most
Mm,
scientific, which those two don't necessarily go together, but they hired a journalist who was a genius with words. And it gets you way into all of this. So that is Our Stolen Future. And then the one that's fun and funny is by somebody who Dana and I both know. Eve Schaub is a humor writer, and she tried to go a year with no garbage, and it became her attempted year of no plastic. And it was next to impossible to do it, but Eve is super, super funny. So her last name is spelled S as in snake, C as in Carrie, H as in help me, AUB. And the book is called A Year of No Garbage. And it's her trying to do what I'm sure many of you in the audience are now trying to do, which is figure out how to quit plastic. My own advice on the subject is number one thing at a time, right? Don't try to do it all at once. The easiest place to look for just for the starters is your microwave. So if you've ever been microwaving with it, stop. Replace your Tupperware to Pyrex or something else, something non-plastic. Those are the first and easiest things. Don't go crazy all at once. But now that you know about the way that plastic and plasticizing chemicals leach into food, let that be like kind of an ick factor as you're shopping. And it takes a while for it to really kind of sink in. I still buy things in plastic sometimes, but if I can find a glass alternative, I take it every time. So juices, I get that in glass. There's sometimes you can find ketchup in glass. You get used to it after a while, finding that glass alternative. You do pay more for it, but that's the upfront cost. That's not, what you may be paying later when you're dealing with hypertension and other things that do come from these exposures.
very good. Megan, I think the again, you sort of like some of your answers answered other questions.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
so yeah, that was very efficient of you. And Teresa
Not my
writes,
first
that's
rodeo.
important points about cost down the line. So, folks, if you look up further in the chat, I might try and put it in again. I put the link where you can register for Megan's class through Bennington College. Here it is. I'll put it lower. Um, back in the chat right there.
Thank you.
It's $100 to audit it as a just like member, like a non-student, basically, and it's online, right? It's all on
Yep.
Zoom. So anybody can
Yep.
take it. It is very, very informative. So
Yep. You don't even have to do the homework. I keep the reading light because it's such a heavy topic. We'll just read a little bit at a time.
all right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. And
Thank you.
Megan, I will follow up by sending you some things, and you can send me other information that you told me
Okay.
earlier. And
Oh, thanks.
folks, there's been a lot of interest in this recording so that y'all can share it. It will be on MRBO's YouTube in a couple 3 days. So, all right.
Awesome. Well, thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Sorry, not sorry. I didn't mean to ruin all your lives. But hey, we can kick this one. It's just plastic. It's the least of our problems right now, right? So we can do this.
Knowledge is power.
Okay. Good night,
Night,
everyone.
everybody.